After getting feedback on my first two episodes, I decided that some of the unit highlights, hobby tips, terrain building, various hobby updates, things like that, would better be um, done in shorter videos that come out more frequently, and then save the larger full length videos for things like list deconstruction, battle reports, things like that. So, in the first episode of Saturday Night Special, we're going to talk about the Charger CGR 1A1. This is a mech that, at least in our local group, shows up quite a bit, but I'm not sure outside of that how frequently it appears. I know when I've gone to some of the bigger national events, you don't see nearly as many as you do locally here in Minnesota. The Charger 1A1 may seem like kind of a piece of junk at first glance. There's not too much that's impressive in it, but it actually has a pretty useful role on the battlefield. And there are a variety of philosophies of use for using this thing if you decide to field it. So first, we'll go over its stats. It has a point value of 18. It is an assault mech, so it is size 4. However, it has a TMM of 2, which makes it a little more resistant and defensive, or its defense value is up a little higher because of that TMM of 2, and a movement of 10, which is much faster than a lot of other assault mechs that you might find. It is also damage output is not that great, at least on paper. When you look at it at a glance, only having 2 damage at short range and no damage at medium or long. It has no overheat value. It has 5 armor, 6 structure for a total of 11 health, and it is energy weapons, E&E. Now, the things I like about this mech, first off, is it's very point efficient at 18 points. In fact, you can skill this thing down to 5, or skill it up to a skill 5, and it ends up being 16 points, or you can skill it up to skill 6 for 14 points. This allows it to easily fit into a lot of lists. So you're squeezing an additional mech and an assault mech at that into your list for only a handful of points. And so when you're building your 350, it's easy to get it in there. And then it has a role within building your 250 lists in that you have a lot of flexibility to cram it into lists and make it work because it is a smaller number of points. Oftentimes when I'm building my 350 list, I try to get a decent point spread, meaning that the units will range anywhere from single digits, teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe 50s. I don't run a lot of units over 50, but you get a good spread in there. And what that does is when you're building your 250s, it gives you the flexibility to kind of plug and play as you build your list and plug those holes that are there. So right out of the gate, the point value allows you to do that. Next up, it has a decent amount of overall health at 11, and with a TMM of 2, it's less likely to be hit than a lot of other assault mechs, which are TMM 1. And it also has energy weapons, meaning that it's crit resistant. You're not going to take those ammo hits and just blow up out of the sky. And it has a decent speed of 10, which I like. I like big mechs with speed 10. Heavies and assaults with speed 10. They have the ability to run 15. They have the ability to get up and take or threaten objectives. So it has a decent speed. Now, clearly its weakness is that it has like 0 damage output at range, only 2 at short. That's not how you're going to use this thing, though. You're not using this thing to shoot, to engage targets at medium or long range. In fact, you're not even going to use it to shoot at short range unless you absolutely have to. This thing, under what I would call its philosophy of use, or the way I would play this, is that it needs to be charging all the time. ABC, always be charging. When you do that, all of a sudden you go from a potential damage 2 threat to a damage 5 threat. And if you think about engaging targets that are TMM 1 or 2, even if you skill up to a 5 or 6, you're not needing a particularly huge target number in order to connect while you're throwing those haymakers and knocking out 5 damage at a time. Now, even if you're not charging, if you're just engaging in melee, you're still throwing 4 damage. So I really like that, and that's primarily how I'd use this mech is in close combat. It's also pretty big and pretty beefy, and so it can get up and move on an objective, especially something that's close by, and hold it. It can draw fire off your enemy or off your opponent and which is fine because it's not that many points. And frankly, I'd rather have them shooting this thing than shooting maybe some other stuff in my army. If they're shooting this, in my mind, that's a win. They're shooting and they're dedicating all these shots to a health 11 TMM 2 unit that only cost me like 16 points because I usually run these at skill 5. And so if they're doing damage to him and not to something else, it's really, really fantastic. The other thing is he's a very cheap area denial unit. He has that 10-inch, 15-inch bubble. And when I've played him, oftentimes I'll maybe try to hide him around a double hill or put him behind a hill or in some woods or in an area where he can cover a zone. And you'll see your opponent, if he's ever been punched by one, suddenly bubble out around it. They'll try to engage him at range because they don't want to close because they know how much damage it can do if it gets a swing in and connects. So a cheap area denial unit is really good. Hiding him behind buildings, kind of closing and shutting areas off, can really be a way in which you can control your opponent's movement on the battlefield and dictate where the fight happens. And he does a really good job of helping you achieve that because he's got 11 hit points, TMM 2, and if he gets the charge off, he's throwing five damage. Even if you're skill 4 and a light mech comes along that's only TMM 3, you're only needing a 7 to connect. That's pretty good. And you're probably just going to smash that thing into oblivion when you hit it. This is a very, very good unit in King of the Hill because it's cheap weight on the objective. Everyone already wants to be in the middle in King of the Hill. He wants to be there too. And he's going to be just throwing haymakers, punching guys, right? And so I really like the Charger specifically in King of the Hill. The other thing that he does a really good job of that I've had a lot of success on, especially since I run him at skill 5, is a cheap spotter. So if you're running indirect fire or indirect fire heavy list, he already isn't going to be shooting. He doesn't want to be shooting. He can meander up the battlefield, deny area, potentially charge, but then spot for your indirect fire at the same time. He also works really well as a bodyguard unit for those indirect firing units. So you have a couple partisan LRMs or a heavy LRM or an LRM carrier sitting in the back, and he can sit there, stand up, look over the top of a hill, spot for them, stand on top of a hill and spot for them. He's very resistant. He's not going to die as easily as a lot of other cheap spotter units die or get killed on the battlefield because he's got those hit points, because he's got that TMM. And then if something gets in the rear to try to threaten those LRM carriers, you have him there to engage at close range and punch them and crush them and smash them, right? So a lot of times when I run my LRM carriers, I try to run just a couple inches off the back board so that if a hover comes in and wants to get directly behind me to get that extra shot, because oftentimes those hovercraft are only throwing 2 dice, they want to get 3, or they want to try to get up to 4 if they do throw 3 dice. That Charger can be sitting there protecting those things, right? He can be watching over them and ensuring that those fast things or those light things don't get in on them. And he can create this denial bubble around that space. Oftentimes when you're taking indirect fire, you're having to pay that spotter tax, right? So you're already paying your 28, your 32, your 36, whatever, how many points it is for that indirect fire. But then you need to come up with an extra 10 points from a sprint helicopter or a cheap piece of infantry or something along those lines. And oftentimes you're not wanting to spend a lot of points on those because all they're doing is spotting and adding to the overall cost of firing those indirect fire weapons. But the drawback is when you're spending not a lot of points is that those things usually don't cost, or those things can't take a lot of damage, right? They only have 2, maybe 3 hit points, maybe 4 at the most. So it's easy for your opponent to blind your indirect fire by taking those things out. Now you're going to be forced to use your mechs to spot, your other combat units to spot. Well, this thing doesn't want to do that. And that makes this a really, really good unit for spotting because he doesn't want to be shooting. And he has a lot of hit points, so he's going to be hard to take down. And he's going to, because he's spotting for indirect fire, he's going to draw fire from your opponent, which you want, because if your opponent is shooting this thing, he's not shooting your other combat units. But if he wants to mitigate your indirect fire and he sees that you're shooting with with the indirect fire through the charger, he's going to be tempted to take those shots, which is what we want ultimately. Model options, there are 3 model options for this guy. There's a 1A1 from Iron Wind Metals. There's also a 1A5, which I've used also to represent him. It's a little chunkier. It's a little thicker than the 1A1 from Iron Wind Metals. And then there's a plastic version from CGL that you can find in both the IS Heavy Recon pack and the Legendary Mech Warriors 2 pack. So if you haven't played with the Charger before, the 1A1 version, the 18-point guy, consider doing that. Always be charging with him. Dominate King of the Hill. Deny your opponent an area and help rein in those LRMs all day long.